There were also more positive results among care home workers and people from ethnic minority backgrounds. But the findings still aren't definitive. No antibody finger prick test is deemed reliable enough to be rolled out nationally. And crucially, there's still no consensus on how long antibodies will protect you from being reinfected.
A revamped Covid-19 contact tracing app will begin public trials in England today. Technology supplied by Apple and Google has been used to update the software after an earlier version tested in May proved ineffective. Caroline Davis has the details.
The app is meant to log when two people's phones are close together for a period of time, suggesting they might be at a higher risk of coming into contact with the virus. If one person is later diagnosed with it, the other can be alerted before they begin to show symptoms. The original app, spearheaded by the Health Service's Digital Innovation Unit, was tested on the Isle of Wight, but the trial had to be abandoned because the software failed to detect 96% of contacts with Apple iPhones. This replacement app, based on different technology, will see users asked to scan QR codes at the entrance to businesses and will alert them if they've been somewhere linked to multiple cases of Covid-19. But engineers are still trying to reduce how often it wrongly flags people as being within 2 meters of each other. The trial will once again take place on the Isle of Wight and one other unnamed area. The results will determine when and if it's rolled out nationwide.
Investigators are trying to work out what caused a train to derail near Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire yesterday, killing 3 people. They were the driver, a conductor and a passenger. The accident followed heavy rain and flash flooding in the area. James Shaw reports from Aberdeen.
The site of the crash in a wooded valley near Stonehaven was illuminated by floodlights through the night as work continued to make it safe and ready for crash investigators. The train was comprised of 4 carriages and 2 locomotives, one at the front and one at the back. 1 locomotive and at least 3 carriages were derailed. One of the carriages ended up at the bottom of an embankment. The wreckage then appears to have caught fire. Thick smoke hung over the site for many hours. The driver had stopped the train after encountering flooding. It is thought he may have been trying to use an alternative track when the train hit another obstacle caused by the torrential rain.
New powers have come into effect allowing police to stop, search and detain anyone at British ports suspected of spying or acting on behalf of hostile foreign states. The Schedule 3 measures were introduced in response to the Novichok poisonings in Salisbury in 2018. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
Britain's intelligence community is quietly celebrating what it sees as a long overdue and much needed measure to combat so-called hostile state activity, notably from Russia and China. From today, specially trained police officers will be able to stop, search and detain suspected individuals at UK ports, even when there is no evidence of subversive activity. The so-called Schedule 3 powers were introduced after 2 Russian military intelligence officers were blamed for the nerve agent poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury in 2018.
A man who was arrested following Sunday's disputed presidential election in Belarus has died in police custody. Officials say the 25-year-old was detained for taking part in an illegal protest, but his relatives say he was on his way to see his girlfriend and was held for hours in a police van despite having heart problems. People have again turned out in the capital Minsk to protest, but the numbers were smaller than on the previous 3 nights. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have set out their joint vision for the United States in their first campaign event since the Democratic presidential nominee named her as his running mate for November's election. Mr. Biden said he had no doubt he'd pick the right person to help rebuild the country in the wake of coronavirus, while Ms. Harris accused Donald Trump of leaving the U.S. in tatters. Our North America editor John Sopel sent this report from Wilmington in Delaware.
In the city where Joe Biden started his career nearly half a century ago, he was back again. The setting, a school gymnasium, with more flags in these COVID times than there was audience, to introduce his running mate, Senator Kamala Harris. He said the fight was going to be rough between now and November the 3rd, but said she was tough, smart and experienced.
Kamala knows how to govern. She knows how to make the hard calls. She's ready to do this job on day one. And we're both ready to get to work rebuilding this nation.
The first woman of African-American heritage, the first woman of South Asian heritage to ever run for high office, spoke of her life story. But the focus was on the coming battle. and it sounded as though the former prosecutor was addressing the jury, the American people.
And the people are who Joe and I will fight for every day in the White House. And let me tell you, as somebody who has presented my fair share of arguments in court, the case against Donald Trump and Mike Pence is open and shut.
Because of coronavirus, because of the economic crisis, because of the George Floyd protests, the presidential election campaign, which would normally now be in full swing, has felt as though it hasn't really begun. That changed last night.
India has overtaken Britain to become the country with the fourth highest number of deaths with Covid-19. More than 47,000 fatalities linked to coronavirus infection have now been recorded in the country. The United States, Brazil and Mexico remain the three worst affected nations.
It's 9 minutes past 7. Results Day is a day most of us remember for the rest of our lives, in particular those nervous moments when you look up at a notice board or tear open an envelope or click on an email. The realisation that you have or have not done well enough to take the next step that you planned or dreamed of. This year the uncertainty is even greater, given a process that awards grades for exams that haven't been sat, and which relies on complex calculations and not simply on how well a teacher thinks you would have done. In this morning's Telegraph, the Education Secretary Gavin Williamson writes that relying on teacher assessments, as they have now done in Scotland, would devalue exam results and harm future career prospects. When I spoke to him a few moments ago, I asked him to explain why.
We had to make some tough decisions in March, and there's no better way of doing assessment than exams, and we had to come up with a system that was fair to all, and making sure that there's consistency and making sure there's checks and balances in that system. And that's why we've had to take unprecedented actions in order to ensure that where there are children that actually haven't got the grade, that they, in more normal circumstances, if they'd been sitting exams, would have been hoping and expecting to get, there's an ability to redress that, and that for me is so incredibly important, Nick.
Well, let's turn to them and the choices that they'll face this morning. Now, what would help us all is to know how many of them there are. You must know that. How many students are going to end up with a lower grade than they would have got on their teacher assessment?
Well, Nick, I'm afraid I'm just not in a position to be able to sort of share that information with you. We'll be sharing that later. The
40%
majority
is what we're told, around 300,000 pupils. Is that the right sort of ballpark?
The majority of pupils will be getting the grades that their teacher put them as part of the centre assessed grades, and we will be seeing an increase in the number of youngsters who are getting A's and A stars of 2% this year, which is going to be an increase, as I say, an increase over last year, and sort of it shows that sort of the progress that's going to be made. But what's so important,
let's turn to the individual decisions, if we could then, Secretary of State. Now, what was left unclear yesterday, after that change in approach that you made, is whether individual students can appeal their individual grades, or is it simply a question of a school overall saying, we think our school has been unfairly treated?
So what's going to be possible for the school? So the school submits the appeal on behalf of the pupil. This has been always the case over the years, because the school's in the best position to be able to put that appeal forward, and that appeal can be based around that child. And we said, in terms of using the mock exams as a key element of that appeal, providing the evidence base, and of course the school is the organisation that has that evidence base.
Well, that's clear then. So there can be an individual appeal, albeit done by the school, and it can use the mock. What isn't true, if you could just clarify this, because it seems to me a lot of the headlines were wrong yesterday, what you simply can't do is pick whether you prefer the grade you've been given or the mock, and say, well, I'll have the mock result, thank you very much, that'll do.
Well, where you have a valid mock, where you're going to have a mock exam that has been done with, proper rigour, and it's been done in a sort of controlled environment that the overwhelming number of schools do, that provides an incredibly strong evidence base in order to be able to put the appeal in and to be in a position to be able to get that grade.
Is there the time for students who are worried about university places to wait for an appeal, which could take weeks or months, and to reset, which will take them past the university entrance period.
So Nick, we're being acutely conscious of this because this is such a unique situation and none of us would have wanted to be in this position. But what we are doing in terms of appeals, as long as schools are getting those appeals in early, Ofqual, the exam boards will ensure that they come back to those schools by the 7th of September. We've worked closely with the university sector to make sure that they keep their admissions open to the 7th of September, and we've worked with universities to make sure they show the maximum amount of flexibility. So youngsters, when they get their grades, will hopefully be the overwhelming majority, the vast number of them, will by the end of today be in a position of knowing where their destination is, where their university is going to be, and actually looking forward and planning towards that. Now, in terms
Interesting word, that flexibility on universities, if I could. Do you mean that the universities have talked to you and said, don't worry, if people are downgraded, we need students at the moment because there are fewer coming from abroad, and we're going to soften our entry requirements? Have you had that assurance?
We have had discussions with the university sector, and universities are looking at being as flexible as possible. But you've got to bear in mind the entrance criteria for universities. There'll be more youngsters this year with higher grades than they were last year. So there's going to be more youngsters who are in a position where their grades are going to meet the usual exam expectations of those universities. But you also mentioned about the autumn series of exams. Now, as you'll be aware...
Forgive me, I call them resits. Of course, they're not resits because nobody's actually taken the exam.
It's very much the first exam that these youngsters have taken. But the reason that we have done that, because ultimately the only sort of form of truly fair, arbiter form of sort of appeal, if there is a real dispute, is a form of exam. But we have been working with the university sector, and we've had early discussions about making sure there's a system of clearing that can be run for youngsters to be able to start their university a little bit later than they would have ideally been wanting to do in the sort of September, October, but be in a situation of where they're able to sort of join university in the January and running a sort of late clearing process.
Now, we are talking before the results are out, which is the choice of the government, not the choice of the Today programme, and it's tricky because we don't have the data. But what we do have is head teachers telling the media what they've seen, and they see the results earlier. One head teacher in the North East is quoted in The Guardian saying that 26 out of 39 students have had their results downgraded, with 1 in 5 having each subject drop by 2 or more grades. Can you understand the anger, the despair that many people will feel this morning?
I can really understand the worries and concerns that people will have. 90% of grades that have been awarded are going to be within, either the grade that was done by the school or within 1 grade of what that school gave. But we have to
say that statistic sounds reassuring, but you hear of a school in which the vast majority of students have had their results downgraded, and many of them by 2 grades.